Hello and welcome to episode 22 of AS for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking today with architect, urban designer and social anthropologist Shira de Bourbon Parme, co-founder of Foregrounds, a built environment social research and strategy business. We talk about Foregrounds work, the possibilities of anthropology for architecture, and Shira's doctoral thesis, How Do Master Planners Think? A Socio-Material Analysis, submitted at Oxford University, 2018.
The whole field of anthropology really gives an incredible framework through which to ask so many questions, and then also to go out and explore answers and discover the world again. It's really a way to be curious while being kind of rigorous in practice.
AO is for architecture.
A podcast about
Buildings, architecture, urban culture,
and
space.
hello and welcome again to AS for Architecture. I'm talking today to Shira de Bourbon Parme. I think the correct pronunciation is good. Shira, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, and thank you for having me. So I am currently a social impact consultant for built environment projects. And my path to get here, though, went through, I studied architecture. I then did a master's in urban development planning and then a doctorate in social anthropology. My practice is called Foregrounds, and I have a colleague with whom I work who is a planner. And together we're interested in working on impact-driven development. So working with clients who really want to focus on sustainability in whatever dimension that is, because that takes on all sorts of forms and brings up a lot of different questions. The social impact side of things gives us a starting off point through which to ask a lot of questions. So while I focus on social impact, our main objective is to reach integrated development, wherein every project considers different kinds of development, if they're social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and different kinds of opportunities that every project brings about to enhance sustainability in the long term.
Wow. So, a deviation from architecture, do you think, or is it a continuation of where you were as an architect?
I think it's a continuation. I think architecture school allowed me to ask so many questions and to start thinking about space in a way that I think before you go to architecture school, unless maybe you're a child of an architect, I think you don't really have access to this kind of discourse before you go to school. And to look at cities and to start to interrogate what's actually going on. And I think also I went to school in Jerusalem at the Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design. And it was during the time of the Second Intifada that I was there too. So it was a really tense time. And so questions were being constantly asked, when you're doing a design studio in those kinds of conditions, you're obviously going to start to question your environment a lot, and your political environment as well as your social environment and material environment. So I think it's a continuation from architecture, but it's certainly a non-linear one. Mm-hmm. It's been a meandering path to get here.
And you worked in practice for a while. How long were you in practice? About a decade, did you say?
Yeah, something like that, give or take. It's a bit of a blur, but yeah, something about a decade, not a bit more. And also, again, in my practice, I started off working on architecture projects, some competitions for museums and public buildings, some community buildings, sports facilities, offices, some housing, both social housing and then private houses. So I had a chance to do that, but then I became increasingly interested in the urban scale. and the kind of systems thinking that it required. And I moved to China and went to work in Beijing for Tsinghua Institute. I started working on really a massive scale and looking at, in China, even an architecture project is a much larger scale than it would obviously be in Israel. And so it got me really curious about working on urban projects. So I was able to work on different kinds of developments there, from new cities to brownfield regeneration projects and others.
Thank you. It's this anthropology thing that I'm most interested in. So my own background is vaguely anthropological, I suppose, shoehorned in anthropology in that way that architects can sometimes be a bit peripatetic in the way that they work. And I sometimes feel like we're a bit like a kid in a candy store, really. It's like you kind of just grab at things and you think, well, that looks useful and I'll use that, and therefore I'm an expert. And sustainability, I'll grab a bit of that, and I'll grab a bit of geography, and anthropology, maybe I'm being harsh on myself, but I'm kind of interested in why you got to anthropology as a device for, I suppose, improving your practice or honing your skills. I mean, what in anthropology is valuable to the architectural endeavor?
Well, I think anthropology is a really robust intellectual framework. It's actually multiple frameworks that are all in discourse with one another, but let's just call it a single one. It kind of it helps you to really consider your assumptions, rethink your assumptions on people and how people live. And I think the kind of question for me was always like, what am I basing my design decisions on? Or am I planning for people that are just like me? Or am I assuming that people are very different from me? There's always these two kind of polar opposites. Like sometimes we assume that the communities or the groups of people we're planning for lead completely different lives from us and have a different set of values. While other times we think, oh, no, they're just, they might be just like us. They probably want the same things we do. But a lot of this is assumptions. And I was really eager to get out of the studio. When we work in a studio, we're bringing a lot of the kind of context that we're working on into the studio. But that always goes through so many kind of problems, I think, in translation. How do we translate that complexity from the outside world inside? We're making a lot of decisions, often without thinking about them, I think, or questioning ourselves. And I think someone I know once said we have to kind of redoubt ourselves. And doubting ourselves, I think anthropology gives us a lot to work with in terms of taking a step backwards. And then it also gives us a way of stepping outside into the world. So anthropologists work through ethnography, which is this way of going out and participating and observing and being part of somebody else's life. Some anthropologists spend many years living in certain villages or tribes, but anthropologists also work in large organizations and corporations. There are urban anthropologists that study different phenomena within cities, but it's really a way of understanding human culture and how people live together. And it's to understand them through their values, their beliefs, but how that then relates to their behaviors, the way they organize their societies, and really to start to unpack all these patterns that we live with. And so that the whole field of anthropology really gives an incredible framework through which to ask so many questions, and then also to go out and explore answers and discover the world again. It's really a way to be curious while being kind of rigorous in practice.
That's a lovely way of putting it. A way to be curious. I really like that. But no, it's a really elegant way of putting it. I'm kind of interested. The sort of the origins, the sort of classic texts of anthropology, have their from way back, perhaps in the early 20th century, have a peculiarly. They have a difficult tone, a difficult attitude. I think that's undeniable, and that they're kind of deeply, profoundly linked into the colonial mindset.
Yeah.
But we've unpicked that that's been unpicked over the years. So that kind of empirical Darwinian, shall we say, idea of the non-Western culture being peculiar and therefore worthy of study, and to use that contemporary word, it kind of others other people as a kind of first point. And am I right in thinking that as a kind of strategy, like, you know, as you say, as you mentioned, you know, the classic anthropology is to go and living with tribes people. And it's kind of like, it's got that tone. When people say I'm an anthropologist, you imagine that they go out and then they find some remote people, and then but you don't do that. You engage with master planners and architects. So it's obviously something has changed in the way that anthropology conceptualizes itself.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of anthropologists, you know, were aware of the kind of colonial tones of where the discipline comes from, where it may have originated, and that is, you know, actively rejected. I think anthropologists say, you know, we make we try to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. So it's no longer all about the exotic. Strangeness can be within our own backyard. We don't necessarily know what, you know, people that we pass on the street, what their lives have been like, what conditions they're living under, what they enjoy and what challenges they're facing. We cannot possibly know that. And so strangeness can be very close to us too. It doesn't have to be the distant, it doesn't have to be someone who we would necessarily consider the other. You know, the other is also, so what we do is, you know, if we're making the strange familiar, is yes, we're trying to engage with people other than ourselves, to familiarize ourselves and to understand who they are and how they live and what their values are.
But
how they make decisions.
What is the value of this? It is an estrangement, isn't it? It's is that Durkheim's idea of about a kind of estrangement? But what is the value in this making strange? What do anthropologists? So obviously there's an obvious value in someone going out and spending time with the Bedouin and learning the Bedouin. Is that Levi Strauss's? No, it's not, is it?
No, not the Bedouins, but there's a lot of, you know, they've each everyone's
but there's this kind, you can see what that is, because in a way it's colonialist, but it's also this thing of describing something that's exquisite and different, which you might do, like a biologist might do, or an oceanographer might do, or astronomer might do. So there is that aspect to it, and you know, that's not unambiguous in itself. But what is the value of strangeness in the way that you now practice? Because you apply that strangeness to the built environment, to actors within the built environment.
Well, I think the thing is that as a designer, whether you're working on the architectural scale or on the urban scale, you are looking for things to hang on to through which to make your decisions, right? And that will always be those are ethical questions. What kind of material, what matters to you and what comes into your practice and your way of thinking. And I think that as an anthropologist, what you learn and what you practice is to start with empathy and to really try to connect with other people and understand and come from a place where you're a bit humble and say, I don't know everything. I couldn't possibly know everything. I couldn't possibly know what you know. I'm just going to observe and take my time and take a step back. And that will help me to make decisions into what I base my designs on. And it's to try to not reduce complexity, because we understand that there's diversity in the world. And, you know, having moved on from where anthropology started, we now see diversity as something very close to us. But being able to then try to make sense of that complexity, whether it's a spatial complexity or it's a human condition, trying to make sense of that really helps in starting to ask questions through which we can inform our design process. And stepping outside of the studio and starting to make observations or speaking to people and doing in-depth interviews. So there's different aspects to what goes into anthropological research. It really helps to reflect both on those strangers, but also reflect on what you consider to be familiar. So it helps you, like I said, to kind of ask yourself questions and not get too comfortable in your assumptions. So it's just a way of destabilizing that in a way, if that makes sense. Does that
Yeah, for sure. And I think from my experience as a sort of an educator in architecture, you do recognize, I think, quite quickly in the process of education that this idea of socialization, which education depends upon, in architecture students looks like a sort of stepping away from strangeness. It's like we try and establish verified goals. The way I think about it is architecture as an enterprise in education walks backwards. Like we're constantly looking to consolidate our presence within established and accepted professional categories. Yes. Like our weirdness is only allowed to be the weirdness that is acceptable to the center. I think that's a really interesting. Yeah. But so how do we go about doing this estrangement? Like how do you so anthropology for me, so this is where I get to again, is that I like the idea of anthropology, but it remains at the level of for a lot of people remains at the level of a kind of metaphor for a type of engagement and the tactics of actually doing it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is the how you do it. I understand that. I think, though, that what anthropology does, I mean, if once you enter into the actual discourse and the actual ethnographic texts, they provide a lot of very in-depth material and ways to start interrogating your data or your ideas, and that's, I think, where the intellectual framework of anthropology really is incredibly rich. I think, in a way, some of the expertise of architects, something that we do quite naturally is we engage in comparative work, which allows us to benchmark, which allows us to identify projects that we were inspired by. And those projects have given us a kind of show through experience that some things work and some things don't. And we assess that. Anthropology, in a way, works on comparative studies as well. So you can say, okay, so in this case, this community may have these kinds of values and this kind of way of life, whereas another one maybe has some similarities, but then some great differences, which makes it very different. And in anthropology, there's also a spatial anthropology. So a lot of anthropologists do talk about space, for example, home, how the home and the organization of the home reflects a social structure. It can reflect the place of the way a family is built, and values, family values or community values. But in any case, aside from that comparative work and always associating your work, well, okay, so this is what I think, so what does someone else think about something similar? It really helps to delve into that wealth of knowledge, and you find things that are so surprising sometimes, because you find that there will be books that you wouldn't have thought will relate, or studies that you wouldn't have thought relate to your project, and suddenly they do, because there's a kind of value system in there, or relationships that
yeah. So this idea of an ethnography,
yeah.
Anthropology's principal device being ethnographic study. In your work, what does this look like? How would you go about? I mean, how would you go about doing an ethnography for a master planning project, or for an architectural project?
It depends. It depends on the project, obviously. If you're working within a community that exists, it means starting. Well, first of all, I would be talking to the clients and to the teams, so the design teams, and collaborating with them to see what they've already done and where they're at. So it really depends on where the project is at when I come in. It can be that there's already a brief, there could maybe already even a vision document, and then they're asking some specific questions, or it could be that there's, this is at a very early stage that I'm coming in, which is the best time to come in, actually. And then there's a process of kind of discovery. So for every project, it entails going out into the site, making observations to see how people engage with the place, what kind of services and amenities there are, how are people using space, how are people using transport systems, or whatever there happens to be on site. I could start, depending again on the state of the project and who knows about it, I might have some chats with local people, especially shopkeepers, and these are always keen to chat if I ask some questions. And then if it's further along, I can do some in-depth interviews as well with people, and these are usually I'm the one doing the interviews, which is where I'm more comfortable. Yeah, it can usually be about an hour and a half of interviews where people can kind of reflect on their lives. But it's very difficult to do that because you also don't want to make any promises, and there's a kind of underlying fear that someone is going to think that you're going to help them change something, and it might be just not it's not the case. So,
well, that's a really interesting one, because obviously as this non-architect architect that goes in on behalf of the built environment makers, I guess the community, whether you're dealing with a focus group or whether you're dealing with a one-on-one kind of situation, perhaps see you and see your role as different to the one in which you have been employed to do it. So they might see you, for example, as an advocate or someone who's going to represent their needs. So if it's an embattled community who feels threatened by a development, then you might become there, and that isn't your job. Or is that your job?
Not necessarily. So no, that hasn't been my job until now. I think it's very important to be very clear. I've done focus groups, but I tend to not do focus groups, especially not early on, because then it is a danger. You're asking people to spend time with you and to give you a lot of very personal information. And that information is also not necessarily information that is, it's gone through some process in their minds of reflection, but it's also something that they give in a public arena. So it's not something that they might not share everything, or they might, group dynamics might shape the conversation quite a lot. So there's a lot of different issues with conducting focus groups, but certainly in doing interviews, whether it's kind of one-on-one in a separate context or in place on site, and also when you do have to do focus groups, it's really important to be so open and honest. And to be as vulnerable as you're asking them to be in a way. So sharing your own story as an interviewer, as a beginning, I find it's a great way to open a conversation, because we're asking a lot of people, not just in terms of opening up, but also in terms of the time that they're giving and the effort. So
that's a really interesting idea, and it sort of unpicks the kind of resolute architect, like a Ayn Rand kind of fountainhead architect, where you go in as this rational person. But this is a hopeless segue, but I'm going to go with it anyway. This kind of goes straight into one of the things. So one of the things that, well, the thesis you wrote for your doctorate. How do master planners think? Subtitle: a socio-material inquiry. If the first half of your title, I'm like, I get it, and the second half, I'm like, right, she's lost me. No. Whenever you stick two words together, I'm all at sea. But it's a really wonderful piece of writing. So this idea in what you talk about. You seem to suggest, so as I say, hopeless segue, you seem to suggest that there's been a kind of change over the course of since modernism to postmodernism, modernism to now, in the way that master planners or built environment designers operate from a kind of a presentation of themselves as, fountainheads with the answer, who act in kind of domination over communities, to something that is much more. You explain it quite clearly very clearly in your thesis. Something that's much more contested and collaborative and imminent, and I'm kind of interested in that.
Yeah, I think so. A master plan, really, if you look at it, and we know what the image of a master plan looks like. So any student architecture has this vision, and it may look quite similar in terms of the style and of what we're seeing, the scale and the plan to a modernist master plan. But today there is a real awareness of the kind of emergent practices that it takes to develop a master plan.
To explain what you mean by emergent practices.
Yeah, so there's different processes in the field. So we know that there's different voices. There are going to be multiple stakeholders. We also know that, a master plan might be architect-led, but it might also be landscape-led or ecologist-led. It might be led by different engineers or different consultants. So a master plan is not necessarily just in the domain of the architect, but certainly a team working on a master plan, and this is what I always find so interesting, is people with varied expertise have to come together. And as it evolves, there's more and more engagement also with whatever's happening on site. There are probably changes, if a master plan, if we're looking forward 30, 35 years to a development, or 20 years, there are going to be changes that happen on site. And so a master plan document is one from which you can collectively imagine change. But it's not change in the way that it's drawn. It's that you're going to change the drawing. and that because you know that there's so many uncertainties involved in actually building, and that you're going to probably go out and listen to people and observe how people respond to what you're doing as you phase a project in. It's a very precarious document. And so unlike, say, an architectural plan, even though we read it as like a different scaled architecture drawing, it's actually very different, because it's a drawing that is the basis for further negotiation today, I find. I mean, not all over the world. It's not always the case, but certainly here, that's what it is.
I'm guessing, and it might be a total prejudice on my part, but I'm guessing that the master plan in China is a lot more like the modernist master plan, where we say this thing will happen 30 years from now, and it probably will.
It probably will. And it may have already started before you finish the plan, which is my experience. So, yeah, no, certainly in China, that was a very different experience. And I mean, I think you've got probably different practices doing different things, but yeah, but for the most part.
Maybe it's something to do with necessity. Necessity is the mother of top-down invention. Like, China was a very poor country not so long ago, and it's gone through this extraordinary burst of development, and to achieve that, it's had to do certain things. But it would be one argument. But so this idea of I'm going to come back to this idea of master plan, but it was something that this point you make about the anthropologist in practice, or the anthropologist's engagement with everyday life. And you talk about your practice as being very socially orientated, to do with conversations and interviews, surveys, and so on. But what about the space itself?
No.
What's that?
No surveys. Observations, no surveys.
Okay, observations. So you sit, you actually sit and watch people act in space. So there is this. Yes. So this comes to this idea of a socio-material. You're looking at activity as it's impacted by the physical space of places, and also how activity is transformed by those space. And how the material space is transformed by that activity. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And how do you document that?
There's a lot of scribbling. I mean, it can be. It's not very clear. It's certainly, I am an architect, so I draw. I'll do diagrams about how people move, and it's not necessary. I'm not necessarily counting people. I'm not necessarily doing this in a quantitative way, but I'm observing what's actually happening, and what decisions people are making and using the space, and how they're behaving, and I think it helps. Well, I just take a lot of notes, so I will write down what I see, and I'll write, and it'll just be a kind of story of a place as it's evolving. And I try to go at different times of day, at different times of the week, and depending on the project, it might be across different seasons too, depending on how long it takes. But and then once I have that, I can start to frame certain questions that will lead me into interviews, and that I can ask about later on. So I'll start with observations. And in a way, it's like, and I'll follow, I mean, it sounds terrible because I'm really snooping around, but it's not that I follow people in a spooky way, but we can't really assume this idea of community, right? We like to use that word a lot, community, but what does it actually mean? I mean, how many of us would consider ourselves as living within a community? I don't know. And so how does a community manifest? Are all the people who shop in the same place part of a community? What are the relationships that we consider, or does it have to be more than that? Is there some form of other engagement that people have with one another that forms a community? And you try to observe that. So there's certainly, there's the initial mapping that I think any architect will do to understand what amenities there are around. Are there, different centers or meeting points, things that people go to quite naturally. So there's that kind of study too. And there is an initial demographic study also to understand, who you're going to be observing. But it's an initial look. So it helps me to form more questions, because the thing is that if you're not observing people and you're not talking to people in the place that you're actually researching, so as they go about, you're not helping people, if you're doing a focus group, I think, just like I said in my thesis about how we study architects and urban designers, you're either reading a situation forwards or you're reading backwards. If you're going to a focus group or a workshop, and also in interviews, you're reading things backwards. So people are telling you something that they did, and so they're having to reflect on it. If you're observing, you're able to read a situation forward. So as it's happening, as people are going about their day, before they've had a chance to filter it through reflections, their own cognitive biases, their own, whatever they had happened to them that day will probably influence, what they're going to say to you. Whereas if you can observe and just ask people, okay, what are you doing? What's up? Can I ask you a few questions? But not everyone's comfortable with that, and that's completely fine. And it's easier to ask people like shopkeepers and things because they're not moving, they're not going anywhere. Or in market stalls, that's a great.
I mean, that you kind of answer one of my questions. I had a very aggressive question which I just wrote down, and you've kind of answered it, which is anthropology literature? Is it fundamentally a fiction? But I think what you've suggested is that there is a speculative element in the anthropologist, which is then ratified through, triangulated in a way through a gathering of not just the anthropologist sitting there and musing about why people do what they do, but instead you get them to confirm it, and then you have to make it robust by running it through a framework of analysis which is comprehensive, based in the literature.
Yeah, it's not going to be, it's not big data.
No.
There's no algorithms. Certainly you can work with algorithms and big data. And I think working, in anthropology, bringing an anthropological vision to that helps you make sure that there's no data gaps. So I am far more suspicious of quantitative research because it doesn't have those stories.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't go through that analysis. And so data gaps, which we all know they're so dangerous. But, if you're asking people to respond to why they're using something, you're probably missing out on all the people who are not using it and not asking, why aren't you using it? If you're asking, say, users, right? And surveys on websites, what do you think of our website? Well, I'm already here. Like we've already filtered a lot of the responses. Observations gives you a much wider field of vision to start with. And it's a lot more inclusive because it doesn't rely on engagement. So for me, and it doesn't rely on this data that is filtered through some kind of lots of unknowns. So understanding through this wider lens that observations give you, I find it to be a very rigorous way of approaching things in a very inclusive way. And I think that's the kind of ethos of using an anthropological framework for work.
I'm sure I'm sold. Now
Excellent.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a convert. No, I because the thing is that when you work in academic research, and we could go, I would love to talk to you also about sort of consent within this, but I don't think that's the right, this is the right framework for that, because that's a more purely research methodology question, which fascinates me, but perhaps fewer people than maybe the podcast is for. But this idea of the dominance of quantitative data gathering, and this idea of the quantitative performing rational analysis and rational information, or better than qualitative data, I think is really fascinating, because it is definitely an issue in and also the idea of the smaller cohort size. So when you're doing anthropology and you're doing, say, for example, a small cohort size, rather than doing a survey and getting 20,000 online participants, which gives you it gives you lots and lots and lots of things to write down. But I don't actually know what its value is, over and above, as you say, getting very granular and going in and filling the gaps in that data.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, survey design, I think, is so difficult. And especially when you're, as a designer, I find it difficult to work with, because we're looking at things that are so subjective. And so when you ask somebody, does this place give you a sense of safety? What answer could they give you that will provide information for you in any way? And what is a sense of safety to them? Can we dig down a bit further? It's really difficult. And so if you've got 20,000 people who've happened to accept to go and answer this survey, first of all, they're going to be people who already are online, agree to continue to be online, are interested in taking surveys. I mean, you've cut out probably most people. So let's say you've got 25 to 35-year-olds who are online at a certain hour and willing to do this. You've already eliminated a lot of people. And so you're creating data gaps, I think. And it's, again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't use it, but I think that the qualitative complements the quantitative, because we can go out and we can ask, why is this happening? Why was this answer the one that most people chose? Why is something happening? And who did we not reach with this survey, for instance, if we're using a survey? Who did we exclude from it? There's always going to be people who are excluded. And the same with public consultations. There are always going to be people who are excluded, people who don't have the time to come, the means to come, who, maybe don't have certain impairments they're fighting. There's going to be...
Well, I think the way that because I've done a lot of community participation in the built environment, the way I think of it is that it's not who are the people that are excluded. It's the opposite question. It's participation is about including the people that like to be included. And therefore you design the engagement to meet essentially the leisure needs of this group of participation junkies who travel around doing community charrettes. And there's no insult to them, because they're great fun. They can be great fun. But actually, I think in the end, what you do is you design built environment community participation events for those people, knowing that you're never going to reach the other people anyway.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's just, that's why I find observations, you answered my question, but that's exactly why I find observations so important. And taking the time and slowing down early on in a project to have that observations. I mean, and that's, I guess, the service that I provide. So if you can't come out of the studio, I will do it at the same time as you're doing something else, and I will go and do it, knowing what the design process is or the planning process is. So to engage in that. But I think that's where it's important to complement the different kinds of information that you're getting as a designer. through which you work.
So in your thesis, so I want to kind of understand a little bit more about what you understand about practice, what your research and what your practice in Foregrounds tells us about the design of the built environment as a practice. Because I think, when we go into when you start off in architecture school, you have kind of fantasies. I think I wanted to wear a kind of periwig and a frock coat and design churches or something, because my actual experience of architecture was very, very limited.
And mine too.
Yeah, I know. I didn't come from architecture. I did building, but I didn't do. But anyway, so what do we know about practice through the kind of social anthropology? What does it tell us about what practice is and how it occurs? Is it? I mean, there's not a quick answer to that. I appreciate.
Well, I think at the first instance, and probably this is very basic answer to your complex question, is that we work on projects, and those projects already delineate the way we think. Mm-hmm. There's already boundaries that are created in terms of the space and in terms of the time that we're on this project and where it is and what we associate with it. And those projects, that is not how a city is organized, right? So we don't walk down the street and think, oh, project. We think about the fabric, right? And so I think the first interesting thing for me is to see, where does a project as a concept, as a conceptual framework, what is a project? And then how do we expand that, or how do we define where our boundaries of thinking about a project come in? So like I said, for instance, this comparative work that we inherently do, because we look at our projects and we think, oh, somebody else did a project like that. And then there was another project. And so we start to do comparative work. It's very dangerous in a way, because it's a very, very different context. I mean, we have to learn, right? And our professional discourse and our kind of, as a community of practitioners, we have that as part of our expertise, as being able to identify these projects to compare with. We have to be really sensitive in the way we do comparisons, I think. But a project, the fact that we work on these projects allows us to do that. It also allows us to think about problem solving, I think, in a way. So whereas in my thesis, you really see how this in urban design, which is what I was studying, but I think in architecture as well, we're dealing with wicked problems. There's no solution. So the solution is always going to be design based. It's going to be an ethical stance that we make. So Rittel and Weber wrote about wicked problems. They introduced it in 1973, and it's a really important paper to read, I think, because it outlines just how complex these planning and social challenges are that we have to face as designers. So
maybe explaining what wicked problems are, because for young people, wicked might mean brilliant problems, but I don't know.
Yeah, they're really cool. Yeah, so wicked problems are inherently kind of socially complex problems, and they might be always changing problems. So different in different conditions, they'll be evolving. You can't really pin down to one aspect or one dimension. The problem is always multifaceted, and also the way you define the problem will already suggest how you're going to solve it. So how I teach on planning for aging populations. So what exactly is the problem with designing for aging populations? What are we looking at? Are we looking at the the issue for the cost of healthcare, or are we looking at loneliness?
Mm-hmm.
What is it that we're trying to address when we're thinking about aging populations in our work? So inherently, how we define the problem will already kind of create a pathway to how we design for it and the solutions that we create. So we have to be really careful about defining problems.
Because they define the nature of the project, which is how design practitioners engage with the built environment.
Exactly. So it's already, we are in a kind of self-referential, we create a self-referential loop within our project. And it's quite, we have to do it because we have to move forward. I'm not saying let's not design, these projects require design and require design thinking. It's just a question of what matters to you and what is. So Karen Barad, who's an American feminist theorist, who I'm not going to do justice to here because she's much more, I cannot quote her. It's very complex, but she talks about processes of mattering, because we're as designers, I think we're constantly making decisions about what matters to our project. And those processes are, I think it's good for us to be very aware of how we make those decisions of what matters to a project and what we bring into it. And so, for example, this idea of context, right? You've got the project and then you've got the context. So what are the boundaries? How do you decide? Is it, where the red line is of your project, or is there something else? And is the context a kind of shell that engulfs it, or is it something that's going to also be enacted and performed within your project? Is the fabric of the context going to enter your project, or are you creating more boundaries within your project? And it sounds very abstract, but I think for every brief, every project, you can address those things differently. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It makes sense. Although I'm having to concentrate extremely hard. I'm just gonna.
Oh,
no. no. I mean, it's a really. Yeah, it's a really because the broadest question, of course, for someone like you is like, how does your practice research get used, but how does I suppose the ultimate question for the doctoral dissertation is why is this important? And I think unpacking modes of practice is critical in light of current urban crises, urban needs, particularly around things like producing more socially, economically, environmentally sustainable environments, ecologically sustainable, around things like the way that, for example, certain urban centers performed during the COVID crisis, which is to say they didn't perform at all, or at all well, or in relation to things like housing crises within cities, where you have this kind of, if these are like super wicked problems.
Yeah.
And so to be able to understand how we act as designers and the constraints that our mode of thinking places upon us is actually extremely valuable, because we have to stop thinking like that if we're going to address these problems at all.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. We have to challenge the way we're thinking and also the way we practice, I think. So every practice, I'm not saying there's a good way of practicing or a bad way of practicing. I'm just saying that within every practice, within every studio, there's going to be a certain way that we organize our, everyday activities, the way we write reports, the way we create PowerPoint presentations. These are all going to form templates that also kind of structure the way we think. They frame how we think. And it's really important that our social relationships within the studio how do we build the social relationships that we want to in order to get the most out of a team of designers? That's really important. What kind of expertise do we allow into a team? And I think, and so this is where I guess I'm coming from, and kind of how do we, and then the other question is, how do we allow uncertainty to come into our practice? Where I think architecture has always grappled with this idea of flexibility, but I think we can become more and more clever in the way we go about it. It's difficult, but I think there's ways to kind of try to say, okay.
Yeah. So this idea of uncertainty obviously permeates your thesis, and yeah. I'm kind of that this unpacking of the fountainhead is a way of not just accepting uncertainty, but inviting, and perhaps even precipitating, making more uncertainty, because it will lead to a change in the cultural practice. Because although you say very generously just then that you wouldn't pick on one practice or another to say that they are or they aren't, but I think in general it would be fair to say that the culture of architectural practice has not produced that which our social standing as professional people it has supposed to do, which is to say good built environments that produce good social health, economic outputs. I mean, we have to take some responsibility for our role, and maybe it's our way of thinking that is, we're always very willing to point the finger at the brutalist architects and their tower blocks and the Corbusian kind of, but we are very, very unwilling now to look at our own practices and say, perhaps we're just doing we're doing another bad thing.
Yeah. Yes, I think so. I think there's a lot of pressure to develop expertise, right? I think it's hard to be an architect, right? Because you're constantly learning. You're constantly, you have to keep up with the software. You have to keep up with changes in, planning regulations and the administration of it. You have to keep up with changes in materials that are happening and all that's developing as you go. So being an architect, I think, is it's a challenge. If you want an easy life, don't be an architect, for sure. So I don't want to say that it's all negative, but I do think that there is a lot of room to bring different voices into projects in different ways. And I'm not talking about co-design, I'm talking about the expertise of architecture. Let's widen that up a bit and maybe rethink that a little bit.
But isn't the temptation then to go, well, what we need to introduce the tradesman early on into the discussion, or I'm going to bring in the interior design, the person that does the color scheme, and you end up pretending to yourself, you pretend that you're being collaborative, but what you seem to be suggesting in your thesis is that we need to be more. The reality is much more profound than that. That collaborate. Go on.
Yeah. No, I think what you said before about, so that uncertainty is not just like a condition that we're dealing with. It's an active part, and bringing that uncertainty and allowing, like you said, more uncertainty. So opening up for more possibilities rather than closing off with every project. Where can we allow for things to happen differently on the ground? As we go. And I think certainly using the time that it takes to build something or to create a place, that time can be better used to experiment on site, to see what's, to start to allow things to happen to the site, and to open that up. But also, I think my main concern beyond my thesis is my interest in integrated development. So I think that rather than talk to other tradesmen who are within the built environment kind of sector, I think it's more important to talk to people who are not. So there's a real siloed thinking, and like, these are the transport people, these are the health people, these are the education people, you know, this is how we organized cities, this is how places are run. But I think we have to break those down and really focus on integrated development, where creating a place means talking to also all the professionals at those different levels, you know, at those different, in those different dimensions of what creating a place means. So people who know about the healthcare system in the context of the project, if I go back to those terms, who, you know, or can our project support social infrastructure in any way? Or is there, you know, how are we contributing then to that kind of material, social and natural infrastructure of a place always? I think to ask those questions and to really address sustainability means having that kind of vision across these silos, and tearing down and bringing those into our practice.
Can you think of an example where this has been, in a, say, for a master planning or an urban design project, where this has been a more integrated approach has been visible?
Yeah, I think a lot of times what I'm seeing is that it happens after the fact. So it's already in cities, and then there's integrated development in cities. But I think there are, I'm going to have to dig around to find the name of the project, but there has been a development in, where was it, in Africa, for new, it was a slum redevelopment with the community, where what they did was it was an informal slum, and they tried to, using the existing footprints, they allocated land and they built upwards. So they densified the slum, they brought more people in. And what they did was they allowed people to still keep hold of a unit. And that unit was probably, if they had a business already that was on the ground or a small workshop or something, they kept that on the ground level. And then they would sell apartments above it, which would then fund improved infrastructure and social infrastructure also to it. And that would fund the project, but it would also densify and bring a new population in with more means. So it would develop. It was a way to incorporate small business financing.
Well, democratization agendas as well.
Sorry?
Democratization agendas as well.
Yeah, definitely. And so, and you know, it's funny because we can think about that project as being something very strange, but we're asking about the high streets here, right? Like the problem of the high street. But if we look at the high street and where it was in the past and where it is today, if we would think about it in a more integrated way, if we, you know, the baker used to live above the bakery. And the baker today is probably priced out in most places, say in London, especially, you know, living above the bakery. But that kind of social fabric of having, you know, of building a community, because you have the local people who are providing certain amenities, they're also living there. So they know their neighbors. So there's a support system that's created at the same time that we can learn from those projects. You know, it's not so far away, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely.
It just doesn't feel so strange once you think about what that would mean for, you know, for our own cities here. When you think about these distant projects, and I will get the name for you.
Makuru.
Is it? There you go.
In Nairobi? I think it's
yes, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to. I don't want to take any more of your time, but I want to finish with one. So how does anthropology help us? How does a social anthropologist architect uncover the possibilities of integrated development in a community? Like, what can you do? What can your thinking do to make integrated development more likely to occur?
Well, I think that's the thing. When we experience a place or a city, when we're actively walking down the street or going about our day, if you think about your day, you're actively using multiple services. You're using the transport system. You're using, digital infrastructure. You're using all these things. You're using local amenities. You're dropping your kids off at school. So you're engaging with what is administratively very siloed, but you've integrated it in your experience. So observing people as they go about their day means immersing ourselves into their integrated experiences. The experience of the city is integrated. So if we can understand that, then we can start to understand where there are needs, and where we can deliver on more resources. At the end of the day, we want to provide as many resources as possible for people to have a good life, right? That's, I think, the measure of that we use. So if we can understand what challenges people face, what resources they really use and rely on, so we don't take those away by accident, with our project. We don't suddenly shift something that people really need, and address their needs. Well, that will always, I think, that's what we can do, and that's what an anthropologist can do. It can highlight those things, it can highlight the needs, the challenges, existing resources, and those that are lacking in an integrated way, thinking through these different silos. So that's, I think, where we go. So everyone needs an anthropologist.
I agree. That was wonderful. Thank you ever so much. I think that's a perfect point to stop on. I'm really grateful.
Thank you so much.
So now we know. Thanks enormously to Shira for what I can only describe as an education, and a very welcome one too. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to Shira's business and social media presence, and a link to her doctoral thesis too. And of course, please like, subscribe, follow and share AS for Architecture all over the place. Cheers.